Hot on the heels of yesterday's financial statement from Nintendo, we now also have the slides and some of the notes from Shuntaro Furukawa's investor presentation. As yesterday, I'm going to review and look at the highlights here and discuss some of the implications that this brings up. Do like, subscribe, and if you want to see early ad-free and exclusive content, consider checking out the Patreon on the link below. Okay, I don't want to spend too long looking at the financial slides because we did discuss this quite a bit yesterday, so do check out that video, but let's just talk about a few of the things that Furukawa points out in this section of the presentation. Furukawa first of all confirms that profits are up significantly due to factors such as a gain on the sale of investment securities. I've mentioned for a long time now the huge risk presented by a transition to a new console, not just in terms of the threat that the new console might not succeed, but also just logistically, things like having to spend months manufacturing and storing up consoles before you can sell them, during which time things like not just exchange rate fluctuations, but also other trade disruptions such as changes to tax arrangements or natural disasters could be hugely damaging to Nintendo's plans. Therefore, it makes sense that they are selling these securities now, securities which would have helped them over a hump were it required, but instead is essentially profit that they just stored up for a rainy day from the previous several years when the company has been doing very well indeed. Furukawa also notes that whereas in the equivalent 6 months last year, where the Japanese yen abruptly strengthened around August, the yen has actually continued to weaken, which is good for Nintendo's export-focused business, as it means that foreign sales equal more yen on their domestic balance sheet. Plus, of course, there were more sales overall because while they actually didn't release that vast a number of games during this time period, the games they did release were pretty huge. This slide relates to hardware and software highlights, which we kind of discussed yesterday. There's a sharper downturn than they might have expected for the original Switch, which is probably driven by a sharper than expected uptick in people wanting to leap right onto Switch 2. It makes sense that they had Switch positioned as the low price offer for people who were interested but not necessarily ready to commit, and Nintendo's recent spate of upgrades for their most high-profile Switch games are surely significant in this venture as well. This leads to the change in the forecasts which were as discussed yesterday. Basically, sales are good and they are confident. They've also updated their dividend off the back of it, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video, and I may come back to the dividends more fully another time. While these run-throughs are probably of interest to Nintendo shareholders, obviously I'm focusing these for a more general audience, but it is an interesting move with broader significance that probably deserves a bespoke video at some point, although the immediate rationale is clear. They have more money, their immediate source of major financial risk, that being the job of launching the successor console, is now looking like a much smaller risk, and so they now have more wiggle room in order to make themselves more attractive to investors and increase their size in the market. The upshot is that they will be ramping up expectations for Switch 2 sales, but downgrading expectations for original Switch sales. Although, if you look at their software sales expectations, it's evidently their aim to leverage the original Switch library very heavily rather than to sell all that many more Switch 2 titles. This despite the fact that, as the very small print says, they will no longer be counting Mario Kart World in the hardware bundle as being a hardware sale, and reverting to treating it as a software sale, as they did with previous bundles on the Nintendo Switch. This means that even if the World bundle continues to sell and drive up the Mario Kart World numbers even higher, it will count towards software sales. Given they're expecting another 9 million sales, that means the increase from 45 million units to 48 million units could be assigned to 3 million copies of Mario Kart World being bought, possibly even in a bundle. That's a 33% attach rate, which seems unlikely to me given how many people are jumping on board Mario Kart. Which means that it could be argued that this is a decrease in terms of their expectations for software numbers sold. Now, this is just a harum-scarum speculation here, but it strikes me that there may have been a plan A to launch a major title in the March of 2026, i.e. within this current fiscal year. This is the end of the financial year, it would be immediately prior to a big film, and so it would have been the kind of spot where they often try to do something quite big and eye-catching. Animal Crossing New Horizons was famously in this slot, and other companies have sometimes used it too. Recall Monster Hunter Rise from Capcom in the March of 2021. It's possible that Nintendo have either needed to push back a title that was perhaps aimed originally for this window, or felt able to push it back based on the pace of sales of the early Switch 2. After all, if you have the option to keep something in the oven for a little longer without negatively affecting sales velocity, that makes sense as it allows the game to be even better and gives you more headroom to experiment and work on what comes after. This idea of potential delays is never mentioned anywhere in this presentation, but I think is seeded as a potential and something to consider for the rest of the presentation, so watch out for that as we go through. Now, this would also make sense of why they've decided to focus on their Switch titles over the transition period. One fringe benefit of doing this, it occurs to me, is to run down stocks of the Switch 1 games that they have heavy stocks of, such as Animal Crossing New Horizons, which they can now replace with a Switch 2 edition. And they can do that much sooner and transition new physical copy owners to Switch 2 versions. If Switch 2 was a worse seller out of the gate, they would have needed to keep a steady flow of Switch stock back because the install base of that system will be much smaller, and so they would need it to support them while they put all their efforts behind big guns for Switch 2, new, big, major games. But if they wanted to expedite their transition, well, it's better to be shot of all that Switch stock all the sooner so that they can build up big reserves of Switch 2 material. As I say, all of this is just a theory, but it would fit some of the trends we're seeing here. Okay, now we have their dedicated video game platform business, and let's really drill into some of these slides. The first slide is basically a victory lap for Switch and a confirmation that, since this platform was a success, they have made a direct sequel. The emphasis on new and innovative ideas is through the increased potential of processing power, which I'm not sure is something that necessarily connects to the way people have perceived Nintendo innovation over the years entirely, especially not during the Iwata era, but all the same, there's not really an awful lot more they can say in this particular area, given that Switch 2 is a classic iterative console. The next slide confirms essentially what I said yesterday, that from here on out, Nintendo will be pulling their focus onto Switch 2 and away from Switch 1. Now, Switch games could take quite a long time to gestate, so it's possible that they may decide to release cross-gen titles if they were originally developed with Switch in mind, but my guess is that we will stop seeing new games announced by this time next year. The 3DS had its last first-party release in late March 2019, just over 2 years after the release of the Nintendo Switch, and I suspect that they decided to make that pivot from 3DS development to Switch development similarly abruptly a few months after the Switch launch, by which time they knew that the Switch was going to be pretty successful at least, and something they could get behind without needing to focus on the 3DS as a backup. And this was despite all the problems that the system had with meeting demand early on, during which period Switch stocks were pretty difficult to come by. Of course, because Switch 2 is backwards compatible, it makes it a little easier to potentially serve both audiences by releasing Switch games which can still be played on the Switch 2. The fact is, though, it's incredibly confident of Nintendo not just to make this move, but also to announce it. They're basically calling time, albeit for some time in the future, on a 150 million strong install base, and that takes some guts, even though Switch obviously had a very long time riding high, and nobody could be enormously surprised that the system is being retired, albeit, again, as I say, quite a while in the future yet. I don't think they'd have dared to do this without such dramatic early numbers for Switch 2 and signs of consistent demand and interest going forward. This is something to look at in a separate video, but it also has interesting implications for the potential light model of Switch 2. On the one hand, while customers may wish for a low-cost model, they clearly don't need it from Nintendo's perspective in that people are buying the more expensive model. On the other hand, by squeezing Switch out earlier, they are limiting the routes people have to access Nintendo content at the cheaper end of the market, and they might be well placed to bring a Switch 2 Lite forward slightly. I guess the question is, does their other initiatives represent a break from the old model of having a lower cost system, i.e., could the IP initiatives that they've got replace Switch Lite and allow them just to have a singular model, or at least to have a range of more expensive models on the market. We'll come back to that another time, I think. In the next slide, though, there's references to production shortages in some regions, which they are trying to meet. Obviously, this is a good problem to have for them, and I suspect that issues around trying to divert supply from particular manufacturers into America around tariff restrictions earlier this year may have had a knock-on effect for the shape of their global supply lines. This is another reason why I suspect that they will be very cautious about releasing a major new title too soon. Of course, they have announced some smaller titles, but I don't think Mario Tennis is necessarily going to change the trajectory of the system's sales in a major way. Even if they once planned a major game for March or even July of next year, they may decide that they would rather get ahead of the supply situation for Switch 2, as you don't want to spend a vast amount of money launching a major new title, but lose out from lack of sales just for want of delaying a few months. I.e., if they launch something massive in March, but they didn't have the Switch 2 stock to back it up, it might be seen as a missed opportunity, especially given how rare these major AAA games are for Nintendo. Yes, they've got a deep library of them, but they take a long time to develop, and so it would make sense to save them for the point at which they would be most effectively deployed. Speaking of long-term developments, Mario Kart World is the focus of the next slide. Now, it's interesting here that they mention it as the first new installment in approximately 8 years. I'm not quite sure what they're saying here. Mario Kart Tour launched in 2019 and was a new game effectively, whereas Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was not new but did launch a little over 8 years ago. I guess they're counting Deluxe as the last new game, but that is curious, as it seems to me they've largely forgotten and discounted Tour, with most of the tracks being absorbed onto Mario Kart 8 Deluxe through the Boost Course Pass. They're very explicit here that they want this to become an evergreen title and the most played title on a Nintendo Switch, and who can blame them after the success of Deluxe? I'm not actually sure we knew previously that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was the most played title on the system. Obviously, very clearly it was the most purchased title, but I could see a game like Animal Crossing New Horizons or even Breath of the Wild, which had significantly lower sales than Deluxe, but might have had vastly longer playtimes because of people putting lots and lots of hours into developing their islands or exploring the world of Hyrule. As people have realised with Mario Kart World, Mario Kart titles don't generally lend themselves to extremely big numbers of hours played unless you're into the multiplayer scene fairly heavily. Clearly, though, Nintendo is seeing numbers that suggest that Kart isn't just bringing people to the platform, but keeping them on it in pretty big numbers, which frankly makes even clearer their decision to anchor the price at $80, however much it upsets some consumers. It also means I'm even more confident that they will continue over the coming decade to progressively expand and deepen the experience that World offers. Just like the decade after Mario Kart 8's 2014 release saw the game built upon and built upon, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Mario Kart World follow a similar glide path and look very different by the time 2034 rolls round. Okay, next up, Donkey Kong Bonanza. Obviously, these are huge numbers for the game given the early install base, and I did talk a little bit about this yesterday, and we'll cycle back to this in a future video when time permits. Now, I like the way Furukawa phrases this particular section. They use Switch 2, he says, to express the powerful yet comical characteristics of Donkey Kong to the fullest. I think this element of comedy, while apparent in other Donkey Kong games, is worth a lot of consideration. The rare games had a definite sense of humour, but it was probably more British in style with lots of wordplay, although of course Bananza itself is a great wordplay. But characters who didn't look immediately comedic, which kind of fits a more British sensibility of things being a little bit downplayed. Making Donkey Kong and Pauline softer, more appealing characters probably fits the perception for much of the world of what comedy characters might look like, bright and comforting. What's interesting here is that they state their ambition to, and I quote, establish Donkey Kong Bonanza as yet another iconic evergreen title for Nintendo Switch 2. Note that they didn't say Donkey Kong games as a whole will be evergreen, and I guess that the next big Donkey Kong game is a few years away at least, although I expect more smaller Donkey Kong entries in the Switch 2 generation. it'll be interesting to see how long Bananza can hang on in the top 10 Switch titles. And of course, one advantage of the Switch 2 being relatively new is that we should see regular updates for these top 10 games. Then we get the image of the many games coming up for Switch 2, although to be fair, 3 of these are Nintendo Switch 2 editions of existing titles. When it suits Nintendo, Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment is included in the first-party lineup, and so it suits Nintendo here to have it in the graphic, even though at other times they've discussed it alongside third-party content. The way they phrase it here is that they strive to maintain the momentum of Nintendo Switch 2 beyond the holiday season. Now, obviously they don't want sales falling off a cliff anyway, but I think the reason they can feel quite optimistic here is the presence of the Mario movie as a rising tide to lift all of their offerings at the beginning of next year. Note there are 3 smaller Mario-themed titles here for early next year, which, on top of the vast existing Mario library already on Switch and Switch 2, should prove extremely useful in their efforts to sell people on new Mario games off the back of the movie. And in some respects, having lots of smaller games may be more useful in terms of exploiting this kind of potential than having one single major title, which would, in any event, generate lots of attention of its own. Then there are third parties. Now, I don't really have as much insight into third parties generally, so let's move swiftly on. Transitioning to Nintendo Switch 2. This is very interesting indeed, and the kind of slide that might become the focus of a more detailed analysis at some point. First of all, let's be clear. Unless you continue the account from the previous system, which not everybody will want or be able to do, people lose their accounts after all, I can't really see how they can confirm that all of these people are new players. My guess is that a far higher percentage than 84% probably did move from at least owning a Switch at some point, as I can't really imagine that too many people would come out of the woodwork afresh, having completely blanked the last 9 years of Nintendo systems. Now that makes sense for something like Wii, which obviously makes a new pitch entirely for people after the GameCube being a quite different kind of experience, but I can't see mouse mode really swaying lots of new people who weren't aboard the Switch trail to join up. It's still impressive though. And perhaps more interesting still is the breakdown of when people leapt aboard the Switch for the first time, and what's clear is that while 2020 was a big moment for them, the driver of their sales for the later years of the system was heavily people upgrading, making it even more essential that they get the mid-generation upgrade correct, something that I think is already looking like a major stress point for them, although again that's something I will come back to in another video. Now, all of that's not too bad if they can get people upgrading at a good rate, but the pace of audience growth does seem to slow down. Having said all this, note that there are no numbers or scales attached to this particular chart, so it seems to be representative rather than anything too precise. As I say, it probably bears more careful scrutiny at another point. Then we get a kind of victory lap slide, my favourite quote from which is, "Multiple hit titles have emerged early in its life cycle." Well, I guess World and Bananza count as multiple, as they're 2, and perhaps to be fair, they're counting third-party content as well, as I'm not really sure that they can necessarily count the Nintendo Switch 2 editions as being part of the hit title lineup, although maybe they do. Still, Nintendo has every reason to feel kind of smug when briefing investors, given how smoothly the transition seems to have gone. Next up, a list of Switch titles, but the emphasis now is on enjoying them on Switch 2, even if they're also Switch games. It strikes me that they will want to zone in on this, especially with Tomodachi Life, which was a pretty big seller on 3DS and has a good deal of potential to sell not just on Switch, but also on Switch 2. Whether they do a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, I'm not quite sure, but it feels like they're going to want some kind of way to encourage people to view it as being better played on Nintendo Switch 2. I guess blowing out candles on the microphone may be the kind of thing they need, but maybe they have more ambitious ideas in mind beyond this. They also want to confirm that they will meet supply of original Nintendo Switch hardware, but with the important caveat, if demand persists. They don't want or need to scare the horses, but they're clearly setting down a marker that they may pull the plug on the producing of units for the original machine sooner or later. Now, stopping production doesn't mean they won't have stock to clear for months or even years afterwards. The 3DS was still selling at a trickle into the 2020s. The question really is whether they still want to be generating new demand for the Nintendo Switch. Given the movie, the Switch still has utility for a while yet as a low-cost entry point, especially for younger children, and there are still vast quantities of first-party titles on that system that Nintendo wouldn't mind selling at all. So it's not something they'll want to wrap up in 2026, I don't think. On the other hand, I suspect with the Zelda audience being the focus in 2027, at that point, they will probably be far less keen to promote Switch as an option for play, since that audience is likely to trend older and therefore more able to afford a top-of-the-line system, which means that Nintendo will want to try to aim to sell them on the more expensive and longer-lasting hardware. The next section of the presentation transitions to corporate management. What's interesting to me here is that this is the first real pivot in terms of strategy under the Furukawa leadership. Iwata's death in 2015 was when Switch was very much coming down the track, and of course, for a few years we had Kimishima shepherding the company. Now, though, we're well into the Furukawa era, and so these changes reflect very much his leadership approach. So, what is the Furukawa vision? First of all, they keep at the heart the same aim: to create smiles through entertainment. This isn't enormously uncommon among Japanese gaming companies who often talk about smiles, but it still brings Nintendo back to being an entertainment business and reassures people that there is continuity in their efforts. It's curious that he says our management team has taken this opportunity to revisit our business objectives. Basically, there was a branching path of reality where they needed to put Switch 2 on life support, but that didn't happen, and so they've moved on to a new phase of their long-term business strategy for the whole company. The next pillar is unique and original. What's curious here is that Switch 2 is literally not unique. I mean, down to the word level, uni meaning one, Switch 2 is the opposite of unique. There's also a note that in the world of entertainment, even the most captivating experiences will eventually lose their novelty. That's why we believe there is value in being different and a constant need to create new and surprising experiences. This philosophy has been cultivated and cherished throughout Nintendo's history in the entertainment business. Now, this is something I'll cycle back to in more depth another time, but there is a fundamental tension in businesses such as Nintendo's between when to drill down and exploit an existing concept that's working and when to diversify and explore riskier strategies. Nintendo need to take risks in order to secure the company for the long term. Maybe they can get away with Switch 3 and Switch 4 and Switches all the way down, but history tells us that this is going to be unlikely. By putting this slide at the heart of this so celebratory a presentation, it is a reminder to investors, and frankly to the rest of the company, who are quite comfortable at the moment with Nintendo doing just the one thing, that Nintendo will be doing things differently as they have in the past. How will that look? Well, the next slide lists movies and videos, mobile app, dedicated video game platforms, character merchandise, and real-world experiences as the 5 platforms they're developing, including, of course, dedicated video game platforms right at the centre. What's curious is that we can see under mobile apps only one game, Pikmin Bloom, alongside Nintendo Today and Nintendo Music, and you have to imagine that they have picked the ones that they feel are most representative of their strategy, which strikingly does not include their massive seller, Fire Emblem Heroes. It may also be a coincidence that character merchandise is linked to a Pikmin display rather than any of the other IP that Nintendo might wish to push, but note that the characters who appear in these images are all Mario, Donkey Kong, and Pikmin, and all 3 multiple times. You can see Kirby if you squint a bit, heck, you see lots of worlds if you squint a bit, but these 3 are in the lead. Perhaps this is a complete coincidence, but when you consider that Kirby is co-owned with HAL and yet is a merchandising juggernaut, you can see that Pikmin, between merchandising and the apparent relative success of Pikmin Bloom in their mobile apps department, has potential for them to reach out in the same kind of way and may be a source of focus beyond their video game platform, though I do still expect video game content, which is, as this graphic illustrates through placement, to be at the heart of their continued efforts. All of this elegantly leads into their key principles, And as I've said many times over the past months and years, the big driver is growing the IP base. And particularly, I like the way they phrase it as growing the fan base, which is a little different from growing the customer base. A customer base is simply buying product, but by engaging people even in different ways through exposing people to the franchises on Nintendo Music or Nintendo Today, they are actually trying to make people into fans and not just consumers. This in turn feeds into their second principle, which is fostering long-term relationships with consumers. Growing the IP fan base, as they put it, includes some rather dated-looking collations of stock art, but of course the one that draws a lot of people's attention is the presence of everyone's favourite Fox McCloud and the absence of any Fire Emblem representatives, or for that matter, Xenoblade. It's evident that they have a long-term aspiration to rehabilitate Fox, who isn't normally listed in one of their major 9 IPs that they cite, although I wouldn't read too much into his presence here. He fits what's being discussed. He is from an IP that is loved by people worldwide. To be clear, I do think they want to build up Fox and Star Fox as well, but I just don't know if this was designed as any kind of teaser of something imminent, though I'm sure there are continual Star Fox projects being mooted and discussed. I do like the way that they phrase this, though, building trusting relationships. This obviously suggests a focus on quality and care, which links back to the ancient traditions in Nintendo's home city of Kyoto of craftsmanship. As they say, we strive to build a relationship of trust with our consumers by carefully crafting and delivering high quality games, products, and services featuring these Nintendo characters. We believe that accumulating this trust is what changes people from simply knowing our characters into becoming fans of RIP. Now, this is interesting when considered with another set of characters not pictured, specifically anyone from the Pokemon franchise, where for every happy and contented Poke fan from the recent slew of new games on the Nintendo Switch, there are several people who feel trust has been breached, with some recent games releasing in suboptimal conditions and Nintendo even needing to apologize after the release of Scarlet and Violet. It's curious that this is such a dramatic contrast with the way they represent their aspirations for their IP here, but it's something again that I might delve into in more detail in a separate video. We get another slide with more about these long-term consumer relationships, and there's a lovely description of this alongside. For example, they say, our ideal is a cycle where a person's first Nintendo game becomes a fond childhood memory. Later, as a parent, they play Nintendo games with their own children, and eventually as grandparents, they might spend time with their grandchildren playing with My Mario building blocks or reading a picture book. This connection with consumers that spans generations is what we strive for. Building these relationships over many decades is another core principle that guides all our endeavours. End quote. I would note that I think this is a significant part of the impetus behind Game Chat, and the success or failure of that innovation will be seen, through Nintendo's eyes at least, in very long-term perspectives indeed, as in if they can get conversations within peer groups and between family members centered around Nintendo hardware, then the benefits they will receive are going to be denominated in very, very long-term returns. The next slide focuses on the 3 cores for their, as they put it, medium to long-term growth. Note that the one in colour is Nintendo's unique and original entertainment. I think this is highlighted not just because it is the core of the business, but I also suspect that there's a bit of laying down of a marker here from Shuntaro Furukawa for saying, yes, at the moment, we're in a phase of really drilling down and exploiting all of the successes we've had, but being unique and original is still at our core, so don't be surprised by being surprised by Nintendo. The next slide draws all this together and makes clear that the dedicated platform is at the centre of the wheel still. One theme in the last couple of briefings has been the importance of how these extra activities feed into their hardware-software business and basically drive core sales of the Switch 2 and the associated software. But I notice that this has been de-emphasized here, with gaming, yes, at the centre of a wider offering, but no particular mention of things being driven only inwards. The reason for this slight linguistic pivot, I suspect, is that beforehand they wanted to ensure strong uptake of Switch 2 and so emphasize the degree to which all of these avenues of encountering Nintendo would shore up their core hardware proposition, which is, to be fair, still at the center of the wheel. But now they can focus again on building up these entertainment experiences in their own right. Note also that in the center is Switch 2, not the Switch family of systems, no sign of the original Switch. And I think particularly interesting, Dragon Drive is even in there, which, if anything, is a sign of experimental Nintendo. They could have put in the upgraded version of Breath of the Wild. They chose not to. They are emphasizing really clearly that it's not just the Switch family, it is the Switch 2. And I think they are also trying to emphasize to some degree that this includes some of their more experimental approaches. Dragon Drive might not have been the most popular, but it does represent that wish of Nintendo to try to do something unique and different. Then there's a version of the same slide which has grow the Nintendo IP fanbase and foster long-term relationships with consumers built out of all this, showing that the 5 core experiences feed these aims. And then the next slide drills down even further, explaining the importance of the Nintendo account system. Of course, these have been in place for nearly a decade now, and while Furukawa is harvesting the fruit, the seeds were sown by Satoru Iwata, who in his final month struck a deal with DNA to create the company that is now Nintendo Systems, with the Nintendo account system following very soon after. This also, I think, explains the logic behind Nintendo Today, which some people look at a little askance, but which has the potential to be a connective tissue between lots of different kinds of experiences, promoting and showcasing different things that are happening in the world of Nintendo, as well as being a way for people to be in continuous touch with the company to at least some degree. And given the huge number, which we'll see soon, of Nintendo accounts there are, if they could make sure a significant number of those are connected via Nintendo Today, then that has huge potential for them. That's not to say that they've perfected Nintendo Today, or that they may not change to a different tack with it in the future, but I think you can see the logic of what they want to do with it. As they note, we view this entire structure as Nintendo's unique ecosystem. By steadily enhancing the value of each component, we intend to maximize our business. Again, they're not mentioning at this point feeding things into Switch 2. They want to maximize each pillar in its own right. The key indicators section here is interesting. 128 million annual playing users is still pretty huge and subtly up on last year, and it does suggest the likely central target for Switch 2 if they want to replicate their current base. However, 400 million users on Nintendo accounts shows the potential of any of their systems. Setting up a Nintendo account suggests at least some level of affinity for and interest in Nintendo by the person creating the account. Nintendo knows the pool they're fishing in, and I suspect shrinking the ratio of regular users of the Nintendo Switch 2 to the Nintendo account holders will be uppermost in their minds. They also list 34 million Nintendo Switch Online members, which I believe is a few million down on the peak, but still fairly resilient. I would anticipate that they will see regaining those members and expanding the Nintendo Switch Online base to be a priority, although they will also need to find a way to monetize it, with it being a long time indeed since they've reviewed pricing in most territories, and so likely there will be some kind of price increase in the next year or so. I'll probably cycle back to that in another video. Still, these 3 metrics certainly are effective ways for the accountancy-minded Furukawa to judge his business success. But of course, once you identify a measure, it inexorably also becomes a target. So I would expect to see initiatives to look to support these 3 metrics' future growth. The next section then focuses on the stuff beyond video games, and they start with the movies and videos. Here they emphasize that this is designed to grow the franchise, but they also note that it appeals to varying ages and, crucially, people with varying degrees of video game experience. It also is a way to reconnect the many people who might have a nostalgic recollection of Mario, but who lost their Nintendo fandom over the years. They note, what has pleased us most about this film, even more than the measurable results, are the warm comments we received from so many people. For instance, one comment we received was, "I was able to cheer for the same Mario I played with in games as a child, but this time in a movie theatre as a parent with my own kids." We are truly grateful that Mario has a role in so many aspects of people's lives and the precious time families spend together. Now, what does all this augur for the future? Well, you can see how in some respects there's more of a benefit for Nintendo in focusing on titles like Mario than perhaps Splatoon when it comes to their audiovisual approach. Splatoon, after all, wouldn't quite have, at this point anyway, the same intergenerational appeal because it's just a newer franchise. Indeed, the kinds of titles that have probably got the biggest benefit to them in terms of continuing this kind of strategy are franchises that were especially huge for them in the 90s and 2000s, which in some ways gives Star Fox more leverage than something like Splatoon or even Pikmin. On the other hand, the kind of medium is going to be critical as well, and I think it's interesting that they mention movies and videos separately. The next slide really gets into the meat and drink of this, though. They say, rather than simply licensing the IP, Nintendo takes part in financing and is deeply involved in production. So their aim is evidently to ultimately produce and fully own their own content, but for the time being they also recognise that they have limitations, and especially going into the massive American film industry. I think, by the way, this set of slides makes sense of why they wanted to launch Close to You when they did, kind of as a proof of concept of the possibility of Nintendo Pictures to be a much larger part of Nintendo's pitch going forward. They also mentioned Nintendo Stars, formerly Warp Star Inc., which was used to monetize Kirby, and by all accounts did this to great effect in Japan, with lots of Kirby merchandise and, of course, in the past, a Kirby anime. They already have Nintendo Sales, which concentrates more on traditional merchandising and promotion, but Nintendo Stars has a different emphasis, treating the characters more like a talent agency, it would seem. I have a prior video examining this, and particularly the implications for HAL Laboratory, whose shares Nintendo bought out to ensure that Nintendo Stars rose from the ashes of the former Warp Star. The next slide talks about a consistent release cadence for the films, and I think the key term here is consistent. Look, we already knew that they were aiming for 3 yearly Zelda movies, and 3 yearly Mario movies would also make some sense given the way they have scheduled the first two. If they start dropping some spin-offs into the mix, such as Donkey Kong and Luigi's Mansion, then we could easily move to a release a year for the next few years at least. Again, I think we can expect them to focus on those franchises which have the strongest nostalgic appeal and the capacity of bridging generations, at least for the time being. I guess this also sets the timer on the Donkey Kong movie announcement. Mobile apps are the next section, and I'm fascinated that Zelda Notes gets a look in before Fire Emblem Heroes, despite the fact that Heroes is such a huge source of profit for them. But despite being a cash cow, it seems to be an app very much in the older perception of mobile apps for Nintendo. The first wave of apps were almost exclusively designed not just to showcase Nintendo products to people who weren't necessarily familiar with them, but also as a potential secondary game playing platform, with Mario Run literally being sold like a game for those people after they tried the free version. This technique largely either failed or fulfilled its need as a promotional tool more than anything else, as Switch launched and then became successful at doing this kind of promotional work in its own right, and now they've pivoted increasingly to applications instead of game apps, applications that offer services and integrate with their core game experience rather than supplement them. But I can imagine that Fire Emblem Heroes, while it may not quite fit their vision for the future, is still a profitable source of income for them, and one that they will be glad to have. So let's move on to look at the game app slide. Yes, there's now reference to Fire Emblem, and particularly to Fire Emblem Shadows, although it doesn't seem like they're making that big a deal of such a new announcement. Certainly it's not being given prime billing here as a triumphant Nintendo move forward like they did with Donkey Kong Bonanza, and it seems like it's a little bit of an embarrassed move. As they say, the cumulative number of unique downloads for apps published by Nintendo has surpassed 950 million. This has created an opportunity for people around the world to become familiar with our IP, including people in countries and regions we have not reached with our dedicated video game platform business. In other words, these games are about growing awareness of the core Nintendo IP, which they hope to pivot into long-term sales, especially in new and emerging markets. It'll be interesting to look at game app downloads and a different set of potential territories as a way of exploring this, although I don't know how easily accessible this data would be. Nintendo Today, of course, gets mentioned on its own slide. I've talked extensively about the use of this app before, and I think it has a big future. They say, through this app, we deliver a variety of daily content centered on game series that interest our consumers, including calendars featuring Nintendo IP, news, Nintendo Direct broadcasts, as well as videos and comics related to software titles. No mention here of Close to You being debuted on here in an exclusive form, which I do find odd. Was this an experiment that they decided to write off? I feel like it's a very significant oversight given the unique way that it was revealed, and perhaps this reflects that blocking people off from accessing the Pikmin-filled version of Close to You if they didn't have the app was considered by Nintendo to be a misstep, or at least something they don't feel the need to replicate or highlight as a strategy going forward. Mobile apps enhancing gameplay, though, is a new category. We've seen a little of this before, but Zelda Notes clearly suggests a step into new territory. It's curious that such a major game as Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were chosen to incorporate these supposed gameplay enhancing elements, but it seems to be a proof of concept for where they want to go with games, at least to some degree. And I think it also shows where their big games can be used for a variety of purposes, something I think we will continue to see with Mario Kart World as a way to launch different initiatives in the future. Now, the reason for all this makes sense. Most people are far more anchored to their phones than a console, and so creating a way of bridging people from phones to consoles makes sense. The kind of odd thing about Zelda Notes, though, is that it essentially went in reverse, where people would need to leave the play experience to check into their phone, although I suppose it also has the benefit of ensuring that they have lots of people connected to the phone app who are playing the regular games. I'll be intrigued to see where they go with this next, and I would suggest that Animal Crossing will probably give us the next frontier in this kind of experience due to the lack of a current Animal Crossing app, which suggests there probably will be something new to fill that space, and the obvious capacity to integrate between the made-up world of the animals of the game with the real world with the many real-time features becoming available. Next, they pivot to merchandising, and this is actually pretty interesting as well. Under the banner of products that leverage the characteristics of each IP, they demonstrate how many products are created, sold both by Nintendo and by partners, but with a focus, they emphasize, on quality. It might be interesting at some point to review the kinds of merchandise lines that they're pursuing for each of the different IP as a way to try to retro-engineer a sense of the core audience strategy that they seem to be developing, but it might include more data than I have ready access to. For now then, let's move on to official stores. Well, there's no mention of the pop-up store in London, but they do reference various cities in Asia and Europe which will have these. More intriguing, though, is their statement: our official stores are not just to sell games and character merchandise. They also serve as hubs for sharing Nintendo information, where visitors can enjoy game demos and events. We will continue to manage carefully each store with this mission in mind. So far, we've seen some signs of this with Switch 2 launching, but obviously Nintendo stores are fairly rare, and with most of them being in Japan, and even then only in major metropolises, I doubt many people have been using Nintendo stores as sources of news and information. It does prompt the question as to whether they could facilitate larger events, although the risk of too many people wanting to visit all at once relative to the space available probably limits their aspirations in this respect. I do wonder if they will focus increasingly on having exclusives that visiting official stores might unlock, maybe exclusive Animal Crossing villagers or something linked to Pokemon. Real-world experiences then. I like that Nintendo Live is featured. I did actually have a script that went on Patreon months ago about this, which I never finally made, but I may one day revisit the topic because I think the Nintendo Live events are quite interesting. They also review Super Nintendo World with its 3 current locations and mention the planned one in Singapore. There were some rumours, which I covered earlier this year, about the potential of a European theme park, but there's no immediate reference here, and this seems like just a way to keep investors up to date on where they have reached so far. Nintendo Live. It's pleasing to see the event return to Tokyo after the 2024 event was cancelled due to death threats. I would anticipate Nintendo Live events ramping up all the more, but the broader question is what all this means for Nintendo going forward. The music concerts and demos of new software titles certainly would seem to mix the spirit of fan expos with the old E3. It's curious that, with the exception of Seattle, which is basically Nintendo America's back garden, they've kept two areas that are fairly accessible with a plane trip from Japan. Even Sydney and Seattle are actually easier to get to than, say, New York, London, or Berlin. I suspect these events are very tightly coordinated and planned from within Nintendo's Japanese operation, and they will expand out only slowly, and I suspect they'll try to keep to relatively close time zones for the time being at least. Then there's the Nintendo Museum. Apparently they need to limit admission through randomly selected drawings. This is not uncommon. The Ghibli Museum is similarly restricted in a lot of respects in terms of how many people it can accept in, and it's probably difficult to replicate this elsewhere in order to alleviate foot traffic on the main location. After all, the location itself is historic, and many of the exhibits probably can't be replicated. Still, I do wonder if they will find alternative ways to explore Nintendo's history going forward. In a recent video exploring Nintendo in 2030, I mentioned that this is something that they could, should, and may look to do a lot more after decades of seeming almost indifferent to their history, with reports of important documents and designs having coffee stains on top of them because they've just been left on somebody's desk. For those of us who are interested in preservation and the history around video games, this is a big deal, and if profit motive greases the wheels of Nintendo's archivist activities, then that's fine by me. They also mention initiatives that span multiple forms of entertainment, which frankly is where I expect a lot of their future ventures to go as they look to service all the 5 pillars they highlighted earlier. My Mario is obviously focused towards the very young players, but we know from their sketch of the ideal progression earlier that they see this as a route for nostalgic parents and grandparents to share the love of Mario with their little ones, indoctrinating them into Mario love right out of the womb. Or, as Nintendo puts it a little more delicately, creating an area for young children where families were able to experience the products. It's interesting as a logistical exercise because if they want Nintendo Live to become a family event, it can't just be for grizzled long-term fans and overexcited teenagers. They need to cater to the whole family with aspects that engage the very young as well. I'm not saying this lineup was designed for this purpose, but just as Miyamoto has said before that a great game idea solves multiple problems at once, you can see that many problems are being solved by Nintendo through the launch of this particular line. It makes me wonder what other inelegancies they are spotting in the flow of these kinds of events that may be solved in this way. You have to imagine that if they, for example, noticed that more teenage girls were disaffected, they might be particularly interested in finding things that appealed to this demographic next. Of course, there's a reference here to the Super Mario Bros. 40th, but there's not really a lot new to say about this, as we've all seen this in previous direct announcements, and this is basically an update for investors who may not, for reasons surpassing understanding, be tuned into every single Nintendo presentation. We then get a reprise of a version of their classic logo written in Japanese letters and with the emphasis on unique and family friendly. I think this slide is worth reading and absorbing in its entirety, as I think there's a lot here that speaks to the whole of Nintendo's vision. They say, "Our goal is not only to pursue unique forms of fun, but also to provide entertainment that the entire family can enjoy together with peace of mind and that fits perfectly in the center of the living room. The many initiatives we have shown today are created with the goal of being both unique and family friendly. Furthermore, we hope for Nintendo to be a name that consumers naturally turn to, part of everyday life, and there for families as they grow. That is why earning our consumers' trust in the Nintendo brand and expanding upon our unique forms of entertainment, both within and outside of our dedicated video game systems, will be key. In order to achieve this, our focus is on creating reasons to choose Nintendo for unique, family-friendly entertainment." End quote. So unique is hammered repeatedly, but also the importance of putting themselves at the heart of the family really comes through. Now, this is risky in some respects because of Japan's now infamous population crisis and the likelihood of fewer families in the coming years. Still, if Nintendo can make peace of mind and fitting perfectly into the center of the living room a goal, they can position themselves not as a rival for family time, but as an enabler of stronger family bonds, and so put themselves on the right side of a very active debate in Japan. I'm intrigued that once again the emphasis is on trust, which is something that we might come back to at another point. Okay, we now pivot to the role of assets and environmental, social, and governance activities. This is a way to assess companies' ethical impact using various long-term and international metrics. Nintendo do regular ESG reports, but they don't always highlight these too dramatically in their regular updates, although it is on their investor pages, and while it may be a coincidence, I suggest the increase in their dividend combined with this particular focus on ESG may be making a pitch for investors who previously might have been on the fence about investing in a video game company, particularly ahead of an uncertain new console launch. Now, I had a full video a year or so ago about Nintendo's cash reserves, but again, let's delve into all of this. Firstly, they say, I would like to explain the role of our assets in maintaining Nintendo's growth. Assets, represented by cash and deposits, are critical management resources. They not only fund our daily business operations, but also support the unique creative development that is a hallmark of Nintendo. We aim to continually build trust with our consumers by consistently creating products and services that meet their expectations. Through this, we strive to firmly create more reasons to choose Nintendo. To that end, we earn our customers' trust, we develop and refine our products and services until we ourselves are convinced that they are truly fun. Our strong financial foundation allows us to prioritize quality without being affected by short-term financial results, allowing us to secure more development time if necessary. I think that's going to be very important. In the highly volatile entertainment business, our cash reserves support an environment where developers can focus on pursuing new challenges without distractions. This serves as a vital lifeline, ensuring we do not lose sight of our priorities even when facing unforeseen difficulties. In this way, we view our assets as a source that enables both our originality and the long-term relationships we aim to build with our consumers. End quote. Okay, there is an awful lot here, but I think it's a strong defense of why they hold onto so much cash. Now, partly, this may be a response to the widespread perception this year that Nintendo are profiteering with their high prices. They want a robust response to that. Also, I think it's part of a long-term expectation-setting goal, as I discussed earlier in this video. However, there is also a timing consideration. In recent years, nobody would question why Nintendo would need cash on hand, as there was an obvious huge cost coming over the horizon for them, Switch 2. Now Nintendo is pivoting to a period which is in some respects more risky. They still want to make the case for holding cash as they have always done, but there's no obvious expenditure that they can explain to their investors. Now, of course, the answer is that Nintendo wants to be able to pivot if and when they need to. If they do decide to launch a new major console during the life of the existing Switch 2, as they did with the Virtual Boy, the DS, and the Switch, to markedly differing results, of course, they will need to have a lot of cash in reserve. I'm not saying this is about to happen in the next year or so, but I could see them launching something a little bit more radical while the Switch 2 is still relatively successful, rather than, as they did here, waiting to maximize every single last drop of value from Switch 2 and then potentially finding out that they can't launch their new system in the way that they hoped and it isn't such a big success. They also seem to be setting expectations around development time periods. I mentioned in recent videos the potential of the next major Fujibashi-led core open-air Zelda potentially not to even land until the next generation is upon us, given some of the development times we're seeing. And while that still seems unlikely at this point, and I think they're evidently aware that they want to have a major new Zelda, especially given the movie, I think they are setting expectations that quality will take serious time. The thing is, all this is vital to say now, when Nintendo is at a high. They know that their high will not last forever, They know that eventually they'll have difficulties, and so setting expectations with investors that their apparent caution is to a particular end is important. It is even possible that they know of rockier times that lie ahead. Perhaps they know that the next major Mario and Animal Crossing games are not likely to be ready for another 2, 3, 4 years. All the more reason to emphasize their long term approach now. I definitely suspect we haven't heard the last of more development time if necessary, although I will cycle back in a future video to strategies that they might employ to mitigate the negative effects of long dev cycles on their core gaming business. Asset utilization then is our next slide. Again, I feel like we need to read this one very carefully. Furukawa says, "Now I will explain our approach to utilizing our assets, focusing on cash and cash equivalents. Speaking broadly, there are three primary uses for the capital we hold. First, it is as a financial foundation for the entertainment business. Having cash on hand allows us to continue our core operations, such as the dedicated video game platform business, which is volatile, uncertain, and difficult to forecast." Yeah, I know. These funds help protect the business from being impacted by fluctuations that are associated with our business. These assets provide the foundations of our business operations. Second, it is as capital to strengthen the business foundation. These are funds utilized for investments aimed at medium to long-term growth. In addition to traditional research, development, and capital expenditures, we actively invest to seize new opportunities for growth. Specific examples will be shared on the next slide. And third, it is as capital for sustaining corporate value. These funds are to prepare for contingencies such as sudden and significant changes in the market environment. They are also used to maintain management flexibility and secure options that allow a flexible capital policy. Thus, our cash and cash equivalents are managed and utilized based broadly on these three principles: protecting our business foundation, investing in future growth, and preparing for contingencies. End quote. Okay, so core operations is fairly self-explanatory, and when they say that this stuff is difficult to forecast, hey Nintendo, I hear ya. The strengthening business foundation point is also important as it reflects that the company is growing at historically a very significant rate, both in Japan and outside it, with new acquisitions like Shiver and, of course, big capital investments like their new development building, which is still due to open in the coming years and features on a forthcoming slide. As for contingencies, look, people stay at Nintendo for a long, long time. They have an incredible retention rate of staff. The senior people there will remember very clearly the Wii U era. They also know that while they ended up landing on their feet from COVID, it's not difficult to imagine a counterfactual scenario where a major global threat would do far more harm to Nintendo's ability to conduct its business. What they're not saying here, but I think they must be thinking, is what happens when their big new idea of Nintendo Switch finally becomes the old idea that people want to move past? How do they keep Nintendo at the heart of family living rooms if Switch loses its lustre, or indeed if other competitors hove into their market share so that the Switch concept is no longer sufficiently unique to hold the audience? None of this is said, but they'd be mad if they weren't thinking it really hard. The next slide then goes into real granular details, and here is where some of the big headlines from this presentation are coming from. Cash utilization for strengthening the business foundation is what they say. So, under strengthening game development, they note the aforementioned building of the new corporate headquarters development center. For my Charlie and the Chocolate Factory style guide to what this might look like, do check out my recent video. But they also mention acquisition of developers as subsidiaries. Now, let's just hold our horses before saying that Nintendo is going to do a supermarket sweep of major developers. I don't think this is what they're saying. These are examples of things they can do, and actually, as will become clear from the next section on this table, things they have already done. But those of you who have followed this channel for a while will know that I pointed to several examples of where this seems to be a strategy at present, from the acquisition of the remaining shares in Nintendo Sales, Monolith Soft, Nintendo Cube, and the newly named Nintendo Stars, to outright buying Next Level Games and Shiver in this decade. And I also have mentioned the apparent changes in Hal's approach of late and the potential for a buyout there, which would help bring Kirby into the heartland of Nintendo franchises, as opposed to being slightly on a limb due to ownership being shared with HAL to some degree. Intelligent systems, I've also got a video on, and while it's always worked very happily keeping intelligent systems as a satellite studio developing Nintendo software, and indeed it was founded by Nintendo developers and they've always been a good working partner, but their co-ownership of Fire Emblem may make Nintendo keen to reopen the possibilities of purchasing them and therefore owning Fire Emblem outright, which might be a beneficial IP for them in the long term. Now, all this deserves its own video when time permits, but I wouldn't necessarily expect massive announcements anytime soon, even though I think in a 10-year window there will be multiple acquisitions. They also then talk about building assets in non-game entertainment, including acquisitions of a video production company as a subsidiary. Specifically, of course, they bought Dynamo Pictures and turned them into Nintendo Pictures. Now, it's perfectly possible that they could do this again, especially if they want to branch out in terms of the types of productions they can do. Perhaps a traditional animation studio or some stop-motion specialists might be next for their acquisition list, but the point of this is to strengthen their arm, not to narrow their specific choices down right now. They are not saying they're about to go out and buy lots of studios. They do mention continuing and continuous production of movies and videos, and note that this isn't movies that become videos, but two separate items that are being listed. Where would these videos feature if not in a movie theatre? Well, they didn't make a big deal of Nintendo Today hosting them in the earlier slide, so perhaps that remains to be seen, but Nintendo Today would be one obvious venue. Then they talk about their foundation for maintaining and expanding relationships with consumers. Again, examples include Nintendo Systems, founded with DNA, their e-commerce website Nintendo Sales, which I have a video on separately, expanding Nintendo Switch Online, and the eShops in Asia and South America, and expanding their physical stores. All of these are retrospective, and while it is worth speculating, and I dare say in videos to come I will be speculating about what all this suggests about the future, for the time being, all this is very much a recap of the status quo rather than anything forward-facing. The next slide talks about the new Nintendo HQ and the strengthening of their Asian infrastructure, including their Singapore subsidiary that they are opening up. They mention specifically, and I know I've banged on about it a lot in this video, but I think it's the dog that isn't crying in the nighttime, R&D facilities for hardware. I'm not saying they've got the successor to Switch 2 sitting on a shelf, but I am saying that they know they need something big up their sleeve to maintain that blue ocean, and I think the signs are that they are aware of it. Of course, software development is also going to be vital as they expand, and the new building will support with that. Again, my Nintendo 2030 video will give you some of the sizzle of what all this could look like, albeit in a fun and speculative manner. Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia are all interesting as locations. We've known for a while that Nintendo will want to explore more territories, and I've suggested Poland, among others, as having potential, but the Asian territories represent relatively near targets for Nintendo, which make a lot of sense. Again, there's probably not too much more to say for now. Okay, shareholder returns policy. As I mentioned earlier, I may dive into this a lot more as a discrete topic. You can see here that this is a significant increase, though, in the dividend come what may. They notably talk about the next phase of growth, which again suggests they really want to increase the attractiveness of their stock. And okay, here is the overall ESG metric. A lot of this is stuff Nintendo have talked about before, including supply chain robustness and notably responsible mineral procurement. Note the presence on their board since 2024 of a director from Jewelers Tiffany who might have pertinent experience for their minerals acquisition approaches, as well as various compliance obligations here are listed that they need to meet, including ensuring that they have 1/3 of their board be women in compliance with Japanese law. Yet again, I have a video deep diving the new faces that came out last year. This section also references obliquely the appointment of Illumination Chief Chris Maladondri to the board when they say, in the area of governance, we are working to ensure diversity in the board of directors by appointing women and foreign nationals to director roles, as well as maintaining objectivity and transparency in our compensation system, including stock-based compensation. We also strive to disclose information appropriately in a fair and timely manner, and proactively create opportunities for conversations with a wide range of institutional investors, both within and outside of Japan, so as to promote understanding of our company. End quote. And most of this, I think, is fitting into the standard compliance expectations of a large company, but it's interesting that they're putting this here at the same time as they're raising their stock price, and I think it's just to show for anyone doing their due diligence into the company that Nintendo is operating in a way that will be considered respectable for most investors. That's the end of the formal presentation, but they leave off with the immediate impact to investors, that being the change in the dividend policy, which is the slide after the last slide. Now, look, I will cycle back to all these topics that I've mentioned as soon as time allows, but obviously my schedule is pretty tight with so much happening at the moment. In fact, I completely didn't realize that I had scheduled a video for earlier today, so please do check out. I know I've mentioned a lot of videos to check out, but please do check out the video on Nintendo and vouchers, as I think it's pretty good. And there are a range of videos that I will put links for below when I am able to do so. Supporting Patreon really helps me carve out dedicated time to get content to you a little bit sooner, although obviously there is a limit to how far that goes. So huge thanks to those people who are supporting the channel. It really does make a big difference. Now, I may be a little less active in the comments than usual because there's, well, a lot to look into from all this, and there is a lot that I would like to make videos about. In the meantime, though, thank you so much for watching. Please do continue to comment because I will get around to reading them all eventually, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.